how to turn a rusty old piece of cast iron like this into something like this. We've got a wonderful piece of cast iron, but it's coated in rust. First thing I want to show you is a Dutch oven we were experimenting with. Not nearly as bad a shape as that one. We haven't even done a full restore on it. I just started cleaning the bottom. If you listen, here's one half, the other half. I don't know if you can hear that, but that's smooth, rough. What I did, I cleaned this half with steel wool and soap. And then I cleaned this half with Barkeeper's Friend and a scrub brush. It did a good job. It didn't get rid of all the rust, but it got rid of a good amount. But it still has some rough texture. There's these black parts right here that are called carbon buildup. You don't really want those either. What I did later, let me twist it around and show you here. So this is our smooth part here, where we use the steel wool and soap. You can still see little bits of rust along here, but it's still pretty smooth. This little pocket here, you can see it's a whole different color. I used steel wool and Barkeeper's Friend, and it did a great job of clearing out all that rust. So what we're gonna do today is steel wool and Barkeeper's Friend to restore this rusty Dutch oven. Okay, so we're gonna start off by cleaning the lid. First thing you wanna do is get some latex gloves or some other kind of protective gloves, just because we're using a pretty harsh cleaner and steel wool. It's always good to protect those precious hands, you know? Take your piece of metal, get it wet. And now, Barkeeper's Friend and scrub. Look at that progress already. Just after like 30 seconds of scrubbing. You'll be able to know when an area is done when it's not a rusty, bubbly color like this. So yeah, I like to keep going till the bubbles turn more of a grayish color and they're not that brown, rusty color. So that's a signal to me that that area is probably good. Visually inspect, you can see here it looks really good. Our rim through here could use a little work, so we'll keep going. Yeah, so take a look at that rim now. Super clean. So this area here is exactly how we want it. I'm gonna go through and finish the rest of this lid and show you how we're doing. Okay, here's what our lid is looking like after scrubbing it for about 10 minutes. Here's the bottom. We haven't got to that yet, but it's still rusty. But this thing's starting to look like almost the day it was born. Okay, we are done with the lid. We've cleaned the top and the bottom. Both look great. What you want to do is give it a good, thorough rinse. Make sure you get off any of those rust particles, pieces of metal, any of that. Rinse it thoroughly. Dry it off. It doesn't have to be 100% dry. We just want to knock off most of that water and kind of clean it too. I mean, look at that. It's still pulling off some of those little metal pieces and rust. Now stick it in an oven as hot as yours will go, about 500 degrees. We're gonna dry it off before we start oiling it. Okay, now we get started on this dirty piece of cast iron. Okay, the inside of our Dutch oven is nice and clean. I'm gonna show you a little trick I learned along the way that I prefer while cleaning it. Take your steel wool, get it wet, and then take your Barkeeper Friend and just put a little on there, and then go and start scrubbing with that. I found that I don't waste as much doing it that way. I was kind of pouring a lot. Now let's go ahead and clean the bottom. Probably the rustiest part of all. Look at that. There's my attempt at a smiley face.
What? Vigorously.
Check out all this rust coming off. I know at some point you're gonna think this project's a little too much, but it's worth it. Bottom part of our Dutch oven is done. Look at that. So we're gonna rinse it, thoroughly dry it, and then throw it in the oven to dry up a little bit more.
Right?
We're ready to put on a thin coat of oil. You can use flaxseed oil, canola oil, several different oils. Those are kind of the two most popular. So we just want to get a nice light coating. Once you've spread it around everywhere, you almost want to wipe it off. Okay, so in going around with the oil wiping it helps get some of the last of that rust off. And so yeah, you lay on kind of a thin coating, not too thick. Now what we're gonna do is grab a fresh paper towel and wipe that all off. The reason we want to wipe all the excess oil off is because of something called polymerization. What that is when an oil turns to more of like a plastic or a solid, and that's what seasoning is it's changing an oil into more of like a plastic coating around it and makes it non-stick. If we put the oil on too thick, the polymerization process doesn't work as well and you get sticky spots. So if you can feel there's like little sticky spots, that means you did too much oil. What you could do is reheat it and kind of rub it and try and distribute it a little bit more. And do that over and over and you can get rid of that sticky spot. Good to go here. We're going to throw it back in the oven on 500 degrees, leave it in for an hour, and then turn the oven off until it cools down enough to do this again. Put in some oil. Start wiping it all around. Okay, for some of these spots that I can't get something into, I'm just going to Pam it. I wouldn't recommend pamming the whole thing, but just these little exposed spots that I can't quite get. And those are areas where if the polymerization is kind of sticky, it won't matter because we're not cooking food there. We're just trying to protect it. So it's going to be A-okay. Now let's go through and wipe it all off. I mean, just take a second and look at this thing. Look how much better it's looking already. And that's just our first coat. And it's not even set. And so here in the cooking surface is where you really want to make sure you're wiping all that extra oil because you don't want to get those sticky spots. It won't be as non-stick. We're good to go there. So we've wiped off all the excess oil. Let's go ahead and throw it back in the oven for an hour. Okay, oh, that's hot. Don't touch it while it's hot. Our cast iron is looking good. It's got one coat on it. I recommend 3, 5, 6. The more, the better. I'm just gonna show you 2 coats. You can use your imagination to do the rest. So I'll show you what we're gonna do. Same as before, but this time we're gonna be a bit more careful not to put on too much. We wanna spread that all around. And just like the last one, we'll come back and wipe this off after we've used this oil on this side. Try and get all the nooks and crannies. We want to protect this from getting rusty again. Okay, now I've got a dry side here. I'm just going to go through and wipe off all the excess. Every layer we do should be a really thin coat. Okay, stick it back in the oven. Same routine, hour on 500. This honestly looks like it just came off the factory line and just needs a seasoning on it. Okay, just a little bit of oil. Look at that thing shine. Okay, we've wiped off all the excess, back in the oven. One quick note, a lot of times people say to turn it upside down so that the oil will drip down. If you have enough oil on it that it would drip, you have too much oil. So I wouldn't even worry about that step. We've got our cast iron out of the oven. It's looking great. The only thing I still would do is add a few more layers on the spot on the inside where the food is going to be in contact. Let's make this even more non-stick. Go ahead and put it on your stove. I'm going to use this little propane burner. Get it fired up on about medium heat. And while this is heating up, I prefer to use a lint-free cloth or an old t-shirt. You can use paper towels like we did earlier. This is kind of my go-to rag. You can see it's been used quite a bit. I'll use like a beeswax type of thing, or canola oil or flaxseed oil. They all work pretty well. If you do have an infrared thermometer, we're going for about 450 degrees. That's when we'll start seasoning it. So our cast iron is now up to temp. We're gonna add just a little bit of oil, like a dime size, tiny little amount, and then wipe it all around the bottom and sides. Try and get a good coat anywhere there's gonna be food touching the cast iron. You will see it start to smoke. That's a good sign it's starting to polymerize. Let this go until the smoke has stopped, and then we can do our next layer. We're gonna go ahead and go for like 4 or 5, just depends on how many you wanna do. I'm gonna go ahead and do 4 or 5 coats, and then I'll show you what it looks like. We just finished putting our last coat on. I did about 5 of them. You can see it's looking nice and glossy and shiny. We've done all of our restore. Our cast iron is looking great. Let me just give you a few quick tips on how to keep it looking this way. You're done cooking. First thing you wanna do is clean it. It's easiest to do it right after while it's nice and hot or still warm. Scrape the food out that's left and hit it with some hot water, and it will help steam clean it. You can use a plastic, probably plastic, bristle brush to clean it. And if there's any gunk that won't come off, I recommend using a stainless steel chainmail thing. I'll put a link in the description below where you can find one of these. Or you can take coarse salt and a paper towel and some oil and scrub it that way. And then once it's cleaned out, get it back on the stove, heat it up, do the same process we did before on the burner. Add some oil, wipe it around. Once it's smoked, turn it off, and you're good to go.